In my psychology classes, a lot of times students start out with, I want to understand why people do what they do. And to do that, we need to understand how all of us think, and really all of us think differently. First, I'm going to give you Psych 101 in a nutshell. First, psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. There's a definition for you that you can get correct on a right answer test. Number two, the 4 goals of psychology, and you'll find variations of this, but here's one set of the 4 goals of psychology, would be to describe human thought and behavior, explain human thought and behavior, predict human thought and behavior, and then influence thought and behavior. So those are the 4 goals of psychology. But right now we're going to focus on the 7 major psychological perspectives and explaining human thought and behavior. So imagine this. Imagine that you have a shelf and you can go to the shelf and pick one of the 7 ways to look at the world differently. So you put on your lenses, and now all of a sudden, I'm looking through the behavioral perspective to explain human thought and behavior. So with behaviorism, we would say, how does well-being occur? Well, if somebody's experiencing well-being, it's because of the environment. External factors are causing the person to feel well-being. Their school creates a sense of well-being. Advertising and media is sending messages of well-being. Everything in the environment is having an effect, and it's causing the person to experience well-being. That would be one perspective. So now let's imagine that we've put on the sociocultural lenses. Now, my dog bit these glasses if you see some marks in the lenses, but so the sociocultural perspective would say, you know, behaviorism has it right, but sociocultural perspective only includes the people around us. So it's not about media or the water that we drink or the air that we breathe. Sociocultural perspective says, who are the role models in our lives? Who do we spend the most time with? Who's part of our faith community? What gang are we part of? Who are our closest peers? So sociocultural perspective might say, we feel well-being because the people that we're closest to create a social context that offers us a sense of well-being in our life. Okay, let's look at another one. Let's imagine the biological perspective. Okay, so if we look through the biological perspective when we try to explain well-being, we might say, you know what, you're born with it. It comes genetically. You come wired for a certain level of well-being. The neurotransmitters in your brain, or the way that your neurons are firing with each other, that's what gives you well-being. You really can't control it unless you take a drug or you do surgery or something. So from a biological perspective, how do we explain well-being? It's wired into our physical self. That's how it happens. All right. I think I'm going to go for the cognitive perspective. All right. You know how you feel well-being according to the perspective of the cognitive theorist? It's because of your choices and the way that you think. And if you can control your thinking, then you can choose to feel well-being. It's up to you. Choose your perspective, choose how you feel, choose how you experience the world. You can't control behaviorism and what happens to you, but you can control your choices and how you choose to interact with what's happened to you. Cognitive perspective. Let's go a little Freudian. All right, from a Freudian perspective or psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective, why do you feel what you feel? It's because of your early childhood experiences. And some of those early childhood experiences are buried in your unconscious mind, not really even accessible to you. So from a psychoanalytic or a psychodynamic perspective, you'd have to go into the unconscious mind to figure out why you're experiencing or not experiencing well-being. Now, some of these perspectives are better explaining positive or negative attributes. A lot of times with psychodynamic perspective, we're saying, why don't you feel well-being? Maybe because of early childhood experiences that are buried in your unconscious mind. And if we could bring them to the surface and maybe deal with them from a cognitive perspective, maybe then we could overcome what's buried in our unconscious mind and we could experience well-being. Let me tell you about the behaviorist when I tell you about the humanistic psychologist. So behaviorism would say, we're all just organisms that are affected by our environment. Stimulus response, cause and effect. We have no control over who we are from a behavioral perspective because the environment makes us who we are. So the bad news about that is you're not You don't get to take credit for any of your successes because in behaviorism, your successes are due to the environment. But good news is you don't have to take responsibility for your failures either, because you can blame the environment. Now, from a humanistic perspective, we're all really special. All of us are special and unique. And we tend to feel well-being when we're on the right path, when we're aware of our gifts and we're focused on the things that matter to us, not what society told us, but what really matters to our true self. Then we will end up experiencing well-being as we head toward self-actualization and transcendence by being doing the activities that we're great at and being involved in things that are about more than just ourselves. That would be the humanistic perspective. Now, the behaviorist and the humanistic perspective, those people wouldn't always agree with each other. Neither would the psychoanalytic Freudians agree with the cognitive psychologists. So part of the magic of this is to think about what the different perspectives might say about how we think and behave and decide which one makes sense. And maybe if we have our natural go-to perspectives, maybe thinking intellectually from another perspective might give us some new insights into ourselves or other people around us. From an evolutionary perspective, this is kind of Darwinism-ish in psychology, but it says that all of us are a member of the human species, and we're all moving along together, slowly evolving over time. From an evolutionary perspective, how does well-being occur? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, it's either about procreation or survival. So well-being, if we experience well-being, that might be associated with procreation, because if we're positive and feeling well-being, we might be able to attract a mate better. And if we're experiencing well-being, then maybe that will help with survival of the species. So harder to explain well-being from an evolutionary perspective, but most of that research deals with sexual attraction and things that help us, again, procreate, what would cause us to procreate, because procreation helps us survive. I think some of you might be wondering, isn't this a little too oversimplified to try to explain humans through one perspective at a time? And the answer is typically yes, because we're more complicated than that. But what you might do is look at these 7 major psychological perspectives and try to explain a thought or an emotion or yourself or an aspect of someone else who you're trying to understand better using 2 or 5 or maybe all 7 of the perspectives. And this might help give us insights that are a little deeper than our usual go-to perspectives. Let me give you an example of how we've got some built-in biases. Attribution errors happen all the time. And an attribution error is I'll give you an example. You run a red light, it was the environment's fault. That light changed too quickly. There's something wrong with that light that made it turn red too fast. But if somebody else runs a red light, you're thinking, oh, they're a terrible driver. They weren't paying attention. So we tend to kind of give ourselves a break with which perspective we use, and we tend to be harsher when we judge what we perceive to be an error or a weakness in others. So one possible way to make the world a better place, maybe to create some positive social change with the 7 major perspectives, would be, how could we more kindly or more hopefully apply the 7 perspectives to ourselves and to others? How might we understand somebody better by giving them a break or coming up with a solution that we haven't thought of before? Because instead of going to behaviorism like we always do, or going to the cognitive perspective like we always do, we consider other explanations for human thought and behavior. That can end up taking us to better places with the 4th goal of psychology, to influence others. And maybe that's how we make the world a better place, using the 7 major psychological perspectives.